Violence Against Native American Women by Miranda, Katrina, and Hannah.
What sparked our interest to explore this research topic was the book There by Tommy Orange, which depicted the reality of violence against Indigenous women, and from there we were really interested in learning more. In addition, we are women, and hearing about the violence against Native American women hit us very deeply.
In the novel There by Tommy Orange, the characters Blue and Jacquie are both depicted as victims of violence against Native American women. Blue was in an abusive relationship involving domestic violence, and Jacquie was sexually assaulted during her time in Alcatraz. Throughout the book, we see how these acts of violence have affected their lives. On page 199, Blue says, "After the first time, and the second, after I stopped counting, I stayed and kept saying, I've been gone since that first time he laid hands on me." Jacquie's alcohol addiction started after her abuse in Alcatraz, and we see how that has put a strain in her relationships with her family. American Indian women and Alaska Native women who are living on Indian reservations are experiencing incomparable challenges that enhance the outbreak of violence against them. They are suffering from violence at rates that surpass women of other ethnicities. Why is this happening? Abuse of Indian women and children is traced to the introduction of unnatural life raising into Native culture. Scholars that support this idea have suggested that violence against them is directly related to historical victimization. It is also suggested that the domination and oppression of Native people has increased economic deprivation and dependency by retracting tribal rights and sovereignty. Because of this, it is believed that American Indians and Alaska Natives today are suffering from internalized oppression and the normalization of violence. Additionally, due to the jurisdictional complexities and limitations in Indian country, it makes it difficult to determine jurisdiction and provisions for concurrent jurisdiction in certain cases. This causes conflict and confusion for law enforcement, prosecution, courts, service providers, and crime victims. Also, the Supreme Court does not allow tribal governments to prosecute non-Indians, and as a result of all this, non-Indians who commit or has committed acts of domestic violence on Indian reservations are essentially immune from prosecution in most areas of the country. American Indian advocates argue that because of the tribal government's inability to prosecute non-Indians, it has attracted offenders of numerous crimes to the reservations. Lastly, the lack of resources and social isolation on the reservation have also contributed to the violence against American Indian and Alaska Native women. Poverty creates increased stress and trauma. Approximately 26% of American Indians and Alaska Natives live in poverty. This is compared to 13% of the general population and 10% of white Americans. Today, there are 26 Native-specific shelters that exist in over 500 federally recognized tribes. Due to the barriers of social isolation, American Indian and Alaska Native women have trouble receiving sufficient medical care. This includes the availability of rape kits that could aid in prosecution.
We decided to look into the statistics revolving around violence against Native American women. We found that more than 4 in 5 Native American women have experienced violence, and within that, more than 1 in 2 Native American women have experienced sexual violence. We found this really interesting infographic calling violence against Native American women a national tragedy, which it is. Within this infographic, we learned that 84.3% of Native American women suffer violence in their lifetime, which is more than 1.5 million women. And out of all of those women, 41% suffer physical injuries, physical harm. We also learned that more than 1 in 3 women are unable to access needed services in order to get help.
What has been done so far? I'll be talking about 3 different things related to our topic that have been done so far, including Domestic Violence Awareness Month, the Red Shawl and Handprint, and the Violence Against Native American Women Act. Important dates to remember is the month of October, because that is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. There are many events that go on during this month that bring awareness to the issues that do not directly relate to Native American women specifically, but there are many that do too. Some include Purple Thursday, which helps honor and raise awareness to domestic abuse survivors. Through Strong Hearts, which is directly partnered with National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, there is a helpline specifically set for Indigenous people that may need someone to talk to, and which is available 24/7. Another important date to remember is May 5th, because it was recently named Missing and Murdered Indigenous People Awareness Day, as of last year. The Administration of Native Americans, or ANA, worked with the Administration for Child and Families, or ACF, which allowed the opportunity to submit names to be put on the ANA's Missing and Murdered Native American Memorial Shawl. At the time, there were more than 150 names put on the shawl. All the names represent someone who has gone missing or was murdered in the Native American community. The shawl traditionally represents protection, and in the community was worn in traditional ceremonies by women and girls. In many Native American communities, the color red is seen as a color of those who have transitioned into the spirit world, which is why it is often used to raise awareness and honor those who have passed. Together, the red shawl memorializes the remembrance, healing, and protection of the families and community in which members have gone missing or have been murdered. Another example of this type of awareness is through Jordan Marie Daniel, who ran the Boston Marathon with a handprint painted on her mouth. The handprint was the color red. The last thing to talk about is the Violence Against Women Act. In 2019, there was a reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act that passed through the House of Representatives. This new version allows for a new list of crimes that the tribes in Native American land can prosecute. This includes sexual violence, sex trafficking, stalking, and assaults on law enforcement and correction officers. The bill also moves to define what Indian country is, because Alaska's native villages are not typically considered Indian country even though they are native land, which means that these new laws put in place by this act would not apply there. Overall, this act is just the beginning, and more needs to be done for Native American women who face violence in their life every single day.
And finally, here's our We're Excited page. We want to thank you all for listening. We hope this presentation inspires you to want to take action and learn more. Thank you.